record button here. We are in 1 Kings chapter 11 tonight, and going to be looking at, again, the dark part of Solomon's life, and I've kind of entitled this Solomon's Demise, and really to see where Solomon's come from, and to go back and see what he had promised God. Remember, if we look back and see the prayer that Solomon prayed is, God, as your people stay faithful to you, and as they follow you, and as they trust in you, and as they observe to do your word, Lord, will you just have your presence be in this place? And it wasn't too long before Solomon began to fall away, whether it was the fame of everything going on in his life. It seems like after this Queen of Sheba comes, and I mean, she acknowledges his wisdom, and it's very interesting to her, and she goes and voices his fame to others around. Then he begins to, number one, already being married to the Pharaoh's daughter, and so having that culture of Egypt in, we see verse 1 really kind of sets the tone for the entire chapter. And it says, King Solomon loved many foreign women. Now, when I think of many women, I think of, more than one. No, I think of, maybe 10, 15, I don't know, But we find out that many in Solomon's was 700. I cannot fathom. I don't know how that's possible. That's having to, you figure 365 days a year, you would have to spend quality time with 3 wives a day, every day, to be able to come close to meeting, well, maybe 2. But anyway, you get the point that there's not enough time for one person to devote. And not only was there 700 wives, but there were 300 concubines. So 1,000 women this man is trying to keep up with. Impossible to do. And so here's what it is. These weren't relationships that were intimate. These were relationships that were lustful. These were relationships that met a basic need for Solomon himself. And these are relationships that totally caused him to disregard everything that God had done and that he had sworn to do and to follow in the eyes of God. And so we see here that in the addition to Pharaoh's daughter, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, and they must not intermarry with you, because they will turn your heart away to follow their gods. To these women, Solomon was deeply attached in love. And, we might say deeply attached in love, but I think it was deeply attached in lust. And he was a womanizer. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, buts about it. And because of his position, he was able to acquire these women. And hopefully, this sounds bad, but hopefully he didn't steal them from their husbands. But he very well could have. We saw today in Sunday school where Abraham and Sarah and Pharaoh, took Sarah, and everybody's like, well, she's my sister. Well, that's a half-truth, right? And God revealed that. Well, we see here that Solomon, as he had these 700 wives, they were princesses, okay? So you kind of see, he might have been in love with them, but he was in love with the fame that came along with them. Here's the thing. When Solomon asked God to give him wisdom to discern how to lead his people, Solomon did a good job at the beginning. But when he took his eyes off of the purpose and plan of God, he met his demise. I want to look at really 4 things here that Solomon turned to rather than following faithfully and dedicating himself to God. And so we see here he turned his heart away, is the first one. In these 700 wives, 300 who were concubines, we see that they turned his heart away. What does that mean? And so I began to kind of think about this, and in context, turning someone's heart away is more than just devotion. It's that connection. You know, we talk about, oh, I love you with all my heart, right? What I'm saying is I'm totally attracted and connected to you. Here's the thing that we see, that these women caused him to turn his connection away from God. There wasn't this longing for God in his life anymore. It wasn't the emotion that drove him anymore. He began longing after other things, lust, fame, even fortune. All the things that God said he would give him. But see, he disconnected from God. There wasn't that longing. And so he turned his heart away. That was one thing that led to his demise. But then we see in verse 4, when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away to follow other gods. Now, I'm going to be a spoiler here for just a moment, because time won't allow us to exegete this entire chapter. Solomon was king for 40 years. Okay? The first part of that was good. So we're probably thinking, this is somewhere probably in the last half of his, maybe even the last decade. I would think the last half would be a little bit easier to pull off having this many women in your life. But anyway, we see that as he was old, his wives turned his heart away to follow other gods. He was not wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord his God as his father David had been. David had messed up, but we see that David's heart still was connected and he still longed for God. Psalm 51, David said, "Restore to me the joy of my salvation." David wanted to get back to this place that he longed for with God. That yes, lust, and yes, adultery, and yes, murder caused him to be separated from, but because his heart was still in tune to God and wanting God and longing for God, we see here that Solomon just totally rejected this, and so his devotion was turned away from God. So it wasn't just his connection in his heart, it was his devotion. He wasn't devoted to acknowledging and recognizing God. And I would submit to you that when we give way to sin, we begin to justify what we're doing to make us feel better. And the more we justify our sin, the farther away we get from God. And many of us, myself included, have been down that path. Where it's, you're a child of God, you're not supposed to be doing what you're doing, but it's like, devil made me do it type of stuff, and we kind of justify, or we make excuses, or we say, oh, God's going to forgive me, it'll be all right. Solomon turned away from his devotion. And what does that look like for us? Our heart, I don't know about you, but my heart longs for God, I don't even know I could say I can go a day without praying, reading his word, singing, having some thought of God. And having just that, just like with my wife. When I go a day without seeing her or talking to her, it just, I feel off. There's that longing in my heart. His devotion. So in other words, he wasn't focused on being devoted to God. When we go on, Solomon followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians. And I want to stop right there. This was actually kind of interesting to me. The Greek word here for Ashtoreth is hold on just a second. That's the Hebrew. It is Ashtoreth. Okay? And which sounds pretty close, but the Hebrew word is Hastore. What this was a Canaanite goddess. A Canaanite god over the storm and fertility. Many believed that Ashtoreth was Baal's spouse. Okay, so we see that this is a Canaanite goddess with the god of Baal. Mainly, Baal was a fertility god, and so you bring the two of these together, and you can kind of understand what's going on here. And I think there's a spiritual implication here that oftentimes we miss. That when we begin to play with fire, so to speak, this is why God said, don't marry foreign women. Don't follow after the foreign cultures. Don't marry foreign men. Don't follow after their cultures. Why? Because they would turn the hearts of the people away from God. Why? Because Satan appeals more to our humanity many times than what God does. I mean, think about it. Look at all the evil and corruption in our world today. The farther we get away from God, the worse things become. So we see here this goddess that Solomon not only married women that followed this goddess, gave devotion and allegiance to this goddess, but he himself devoted himself to this goddess, built poles and idols. Then we see Milcom, which is, in the Hebrew, it was Molech. And of course, this is a god of child sacrifice. I tried to do some research on this to wrap my mind around this because, being a father, you hurt one of my kids, I'm going to hurt you, that type of thing. And I think we're all like that with our parents, very protective, or with our kids as parents. And so I can't imagine sacrificing my child. I did a little bit of research, not a whole lot, because they don't know a whole lot about this, especially in our culture, except when you really look at Molech and being the idol of the Ammonites. And it really was kind of a sacrificing as one who committed whoredom with someone, and they would take that child and sacrifice it to the god, maybe even to atone for their whoredom. And I began to think about that and think, well, that's not very far away from abortion today, is it not? That, a child born unwanted, so what do? Because of that sin of adultery, whoredom, call it as it is, that the child is sacrificed. I don't want that child, and I give it up, so, maybe there's forgiveness there. I'm thinking this is a terrible cultish religion, and Solomon embraced it. How could someone who at once was devoted to God, once his heart was turned toward God, how could he allow this to go on? Here's the thing. When we start playing with fire, the demise was he was callous to it. He was immune to, at the time, the Spirit didn't speak like the Spirit does with us today, but we've seen people who may have been on fire for God, and all of a sudden they start falling away because they let the things of this world come and they turn their devotion away from God. We go on in verse 6, and Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight, and unlike his father David, he did not remain loyal to the Lord. So his loyalty was turned away from God. Not only just the devotion, but the loyalty. At least David came back. At least David, on his deathbed, David knew where he was with God. Solomon's loyalty was gone. His loyalty was to himself. At the end, that's ultimately where it was. Then we go on and we see at this time Solomon built a high place for Chemosh. Chemosh was another god that was a god of the Moabites. And Chemosh was more of a destroyer, subduer, or even a fish god. I'm not quite sure what the fish god, where that comes in, but that was just a definition that I pulled up. So we see here that really and maybe even this fish god, I mean, that was an industry in the days, especially around Moab and different places that were near the rivers, and of course not too far from the Mediterranean Sea. You had a lot of fishing. This was the industry, and so the allegiance was to that God. Which let's fast forward to the New Testament real quick. The disciples, they were what? They were out fishing, living their livelihood, and Jesus said, "Come and follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." In other words, you're not going to dedicate your life to what you can do or to this industry anymore. You're going to dedicate your life to bringing in people to me and to my family. And so we see here that he builds this high place, and many times the high place wasn't necessarily a temple, but was an altar. It was a place where they could come and worship. And so this was built in honor of Chemosh. And we see that all of these idols were on the hill across from Jerusalem. Was Jerusalem? Jerusalem was the capital city. Jerusalem was a place where the temple. At least he didn't build. Let's give him credit, just maybe that much. At least he didn't build them in the temple of God. Now that's about the only credit I could give him at this point. But at least he didn't build them. They were across the hill from Jerusalem. Why was that? Because Solomon knew at the end of the day, this wasn't right. And yet he continued. We see here that he did the same for all his foreign wives. So all this was done to please his wives. And they burned incense and offering sacrifices to their gods. Look at verse 9 now, in 1 Kings 11. The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Remember, the first time was a dream at Gibeon, where God said, "Ask what you will and I'll give it to you." And Solomon asked for wisdom. The second time was at the dedication of the temple and we read that God's answer. We see again, 2 Chronicles chapter 7, reiteration of that same thing that we read in 1 Kings. And so he commanded in verse 10, he commanded him about this so that he would not follow other gods, but Solomon did not do what the Lord had commanded. And so the fourth thing that we see here is that his obedience was turned away from God. His heart was turned, his devotion was turned, his loyalty was turned, his obedience was turned. All four things are imperative to being right with God. And Solomon had turned away from all four of them. Well, what began to happen? The Lord said in verse 11, said to Solomon, "Since you have done this and did not keep my covenant and my statutes, which I commanded you, I will tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant." Now the servant means his son. "However, I will not do it during your lifetime for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of your son's hand. Yet I will not tear the entire kingdom away from him. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem that I chose." So in the midst of God's punishment, we see God's grace. And the promise that he kept to David is there will not fail to be a king to sit on your throne. We take a detour here in verse 14, and we get a picture of Solomon's enemies. Hadad, who was just a young boy, when Joab killed not just his father, but every male in Edom. Hadad escaped. Now Hadad escaped to Egypt. I'm fast forwarding, you can read all this. Hadad escapes to Egypt, and there he becomes acquainted with with the Pharaoh of Egypt. He grows up. The Pharaoh likes him. The Pharaoh blesses him. The Pharaoh gives him a wife. And it was the sister of his own wife. So Pharaoh liked him so much that he became his brother-in-law. This man, Hadad, became an adversary to Solomon and became a thorn in Solomon's side. We see that Solomon, as he is trying to build the supporting terraces and repair the opening wall of the city of his father David, that he puts Jeroboam, his son, in charge of basically being the foreman over the entire labor force. And so Jeroboam begins to have some of this power, and we see that Ahijah in verse 30 took hold. He meets Jeroboam out on the road coming out of Jerusalem, and in verse 30 he takes hold of a new cloak that he had on. He tears it into 12 pieces. In verse 31, Ahijah gives Jeroboam a prophecy, and he says this: "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord God of Israel says: I am about to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand, and I will give you 10 tribes." So here Jeroboam is told by the prophet that he's going to be leader over 10 tribes of the nation of Israel. We will go on to find out that these tribes, as we've talked about before, they become the northern tribes, and there will be the 10 tribes north of Jerusalem, and they will be led by Jeroboam and then other kings. These tribes are going to resoundingly be the ungodly tribes, have ungodly kings, and ultimately will not follow God at all. They're going to follow the way of Solomon. And we'll see next week that Rehoboam becomes a tribe of just Judah, and that lower part would be the southern tribes, really Judah and Benjamin. He'll be the king of the southern tribes, and they will have their problems in having godly kings, but they will largely be devoted to God for the most part. And so we see here, verse 32, it says, "But one tribe will remain his for the sake of my servant David, for the sake of Jerusalem and the city I chose out of all the tribes of Israel." Again, we see this prophecy of division, but we also see the promise of dedication. God had dedicated and promised not just David, but Abraham. And so we see here God keeping that promise. And then we go on and see that Solomon then begins to see that Jeroboam is starting a revolt. And so Solomon actually tries to kill his own son to get him out of the way. And we see in verse 40, Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but he fled to Egypt, to King Shishak of Egypt, where he remained until Solomon's death. So Jeroboam flees to Egypt, and that's where we pick up in chapter 12. Solomon dies, and then we see that Rehoboam becomes king in Solomon's place. And so the land hasn't been divided, but we're going to find out next week that Rehoboam comes into the kingship in a very problematic time. And as soon as the death of Solomon gets back to Jeroboam, you're going to have this clash of siblings, and you're going to have a division of the nation of Israel. And that division remains, really, has never come back to together. I mean, they did bring the tribes, as we've seen in our studies over the past year or two, whether it's been through Jeremiah or the prophets that we studied on Friday mornings or different times, we've seen that the nation was brought back. In Ezra and Nehemiah, there was a rebuilding, but there was always this schism in the north and the south. And really, as far as I understand, it still kind of remains today. And that's on top of the schism between Ishmael and Isaac in those two tribes, which we would say the Jews and the Arabs. And so we see here really a very sad time in the life of Solomon, where he had everything going for him. He was where he needed to be, but yet his demise was in relation to keeping his heart, keeping his devotion, keeping his loyalty, and keeping his obedience in check and focused on God. And when he began to let his life veer off, to follow lust, to follow these other things, he met his demise. And the demise cost him not just his life, not just his kingship, but it really cost him the unity of his family, which really, I think, goes back. Remember what God told David, that the sword would never depart out of David's house. And so we see that there's consequences. God doesn't just wink at sin, that God's gracious, he's forgiving, he's loving, and we need to keep ourselves in line and in check. But we also need to be careful that we don't allow ourselves to get too far away. And I'm preaching to the choir tonight, I know that, but as we look around us, we see a lot of people in unfaithfulness, and just, we see their children. You guys have seen it more than I have, where just gradually, generation after generation, there's less faithfulness, and before long, there's no faithfulness. This is exactly where Solomon was. And so we need to pray. We need to pray for our church. We need to pray for the church as a whole. We need to pray for ourselves and make sure that although we can't turn the ship around by ourselves, we can start by making sure we're right with God and doing what God's called us to do. And so we're going to close tonight by